Does PlayStation's new HDR option really do anything on the PlayStation 4? Today, that's the answer I'm going to be giving you guys. You see, as many of you may have already figured out, the HDR of today is standardless, as I've mentioned in my last episode. And PlayStation has come up with an answer to this ever standardless HDR in the form of a menu option on the PlayStation that would give you the ability to go in and hypothetically adjust everything you need to about your HDR in the console itself, opposed to having to rely on the game manufacturer to get it right. But does this actually work? And is it something that can actually be seen as a template, even as a guideline for how to implement HDR in future projects? That's what we're going to be looking at today, so let's get into it. Alright everyone, so we're going to go into our sound and screen options, then we're going to hit video output settings, then we're going to go down to HDR adjust or adjust HDR. It'll say your TV does not support HDR if you keep it in SDR like I do all the time, so you'll have to set it to automatic if you don't have it already there, and then you'll have to turn HDR to automatic as well. Then go to adjust HDR, the new option added by the firmware update, and then they'll tell you some nonsense about how it will adjust the HDR for your game and, you know, blase, things of that nature. Now, you're going to adjust it until this little PlayStation logo is no longer, not no longer visible, but almost invisible. So what I like to do is go to the point where it disappears completely and then just bring it back by one. And then, again, I do the same thing on this pattern or whatever you want to call it. And then we do it again for the black. That is completely invisible, so right until it's almost invisible is right about there, and just like that, we've dialed in our HDR settings. Now, what we're gonna do is fire up Horizon Zero Dawn, and then see what this is actually all about. And like magic, here we are in HDR. Now, the first thing I'm noticing is that the tone mapping of the Horizon, like sun in the sky up there, like that thing is looking incredible. So let's go actually into HDR and see what our results will end up looking like. Intro movie, we're just gonna go straight into that since that's something pretty much everyone watching this video with this game and PlayStation 4 can access. So initially, I'm not noticing anything that's out of the norm, and I think that's good. So far, it's looking really good, very on par with what I would notice on SDR, with the exception of the tone mapping. So one of HDR's biggest benefits is that, you know, when done correctly, you can see clouds in the sky and little fine details a little clearer, and that usually does come at the, again, scale back, setback of having to determine what to sacrifice in your image quality. Now, I've also taken a step further and going into my Samsung Q8FN and optimizing it to the absolute best I could probably do for this TV. And as you can see, hopefully on your end through these really natural skin tones, nothing's bleeding, nothing's oversaturated or cartoonish or garish or anything like that. It just looks really, really decent. And this is one of the things that has me starting to look at PlayStation a little more favorably, especially as we start to go into the next generation of video gaming consoles. Because, I mean, think about it like this. I mean, here we are with a game that launched in, what was it, like 2017, 2016? I mean, this game, by no stretch of the imagination, is brand spanking new, and it looks freaking good. I mean, this is still the pinnacle of HDR, but look at that sun tone mapping in the sky. I don't know how well you'll see it on YouTube, but on my end, it just looks incredible. And I'm really seeing a big difference in this game, noticing details, particularly the highlights, that have not been tone mapped to this great degree until this patch launched. So this patch definitely does do something, and I'm impressed. I will say it's making the depth of field a lot more visible in some games, and I haven't seen any difference in movies, but for video games, I've definitely noticed a difference. And this whole scene right here, it just really looks pretty crisp and pristine, as you have these little robotic, I guess, dinosaurs, if you will, walking across the plane. It just really does come out. Now, one of the things that does bother me with HDR, though, is the tonality of colors. So it does trend towards a little bit more on the greenish side of things, and that's even post-calibration. There's not really much you could do for HDR, because again, you can't calibrate to a standard. You can just try to adjust it, you know, to the best of your ability and to the way your eyes see things. And I gotta say though, this is looking pretty darn good. For HDR, you guys know my stance on HDR, and I must say, this looks really good. I'm very impressed by the results. I mean, you can see the draw distances a lot better, the mountain, you can see a lot more of the mountain. All the stuff is very clear, and I'm really, really digging the depth of field. I mean, like the punch coming out of this image right now is very incredible. Now, to be fair, I am using a Samsung Q8FN. If you do have a lower end television, it definitely won't be on the same level perhaps. Maybe something we'll investigate in a different episode, but I can say right now for a Samsung Q8FN television, this is pretty darn nice. The flames in the background, tone mapping very tightly to the candle's body. I think that's important as well. Clouds looking a little blown out in the back, not as much detail when you start having a character in the foreground. We've got nice tone mapping off of the little fur from the little, whatever she is, matriarch lady. You know, you've got it just blasting off. It looked really good there. Now we're getting some of those highlights back and things like the tree bark. I mean, this whole scene is just a ballet of color. I really don't know how well it's going to show on your end, but this is incredible. As that sun is rising, the sun is very, very, very tight to the body. And I think, honestly, this is something that, yeah, that's so much better than what it was looking like before. Definitely. Because now I'm seeing the clouds as defined, sharp, I mean, tack sharp lines, and every little detail I'm noticing I can see. So I think there's definitely an improvement with this new HDR adjustment, and it makes me wonder, like, what if we see this on Xbox? What if we can get more, again, source boxes or even TV manufacturers to implement something like this that will allow you to, in your television, set up your own HDR based off of some pre-imposed patterns, and then go from there and get a better HDR experience than just saying, you know, leave it up to the content creator that, quite frankly, might not necessarily know how to work best with that device. So that's food for thought there, because I know across devices HDR is even different. Some people have issues with Apple TV, some people have issues with their Xboxes. I mean, it's all over the place. But this PlayStation update, it does look really darn good. Now I am seeing a double image there as it's like falling into place, and I think that's more or less a flaw of the developer, not necessarily the patch, so I won't dock it for that. But so far, HDR on this TV, the Samsung Q8FN, that was pretty damn spectacular for that intro. Now let's see it in SDR and see if there's a difference. Alright, and now we're in the SDR variant of this game, and immediately the first thing I notice is that text is not as sharp, and the sun is basically now invisible in the background here. So far, HDR is taking the win after that update. And I love seeing that. You know, I want HDR to improve, and it seems like Sony really is finding their little groove here as far as the HDR colors are concerned. Now, as I'm looking at this SDR version, I am noticing that colors are looking a little bit on the pinker side of things, so I think that's more something to do with the TV or maybe even SDR in general. I can't really say. But it is looking less green than HDR, though I've already known going into it that SDR does tend to trend a little bit more, I guess, red, if you would, than, you know, the HDR version. HDR is very, very green, so that is one of the downsides of HDR, because it doesn't always look good for all content. But even still, I'm noticing natural skin tonalities. There's no over bleeding of color into the faces. Though admittedly, as I look at this scene, not as impressive as it was in the HDR version. So that is something to note here. As he's walking down these steps in the snow, I'm still seeing the same amount of detail. That's pretty much a draw there. I'm noticing this is definitely a little overblown here. You don't have a lot of detail. Now as he's walking through this pass here, that's about the same. There's a lot less as far as tight contrast in this scene here. there is a sun in the sky, but it's nowhere near as close. I mean, I think SDR for this particular game is definitely blowing things out a little bit, and it is definitely clear that what Sony has done with their brand new algorithm has tightened up that video game's performance to a great degree. I mean, like, it's incredible to see the differences. I mean, you're talking about before, HDR was really, really dim, and of course, I didn't prefer it. I wanted the punchiness behind it, and I gotta say, after this update, what Sony has managed to do is incredible. Now, you still have light rays and things like that that belong, but ultimately, I mean, really, the experience slides off quickly. I mean, quite rapidly. I'm nowhere near as impressed with the HDR version of this game running that same exact, you know, HDR menu. Well, not the same exact HDR menu. I'm like lost in thought here just because I'm kind of like taken back, because when you do this commentary, I don't do scripts or anything, so I'm just going off my head, and I tell you right now, it's crazy to see the difference between these colors, man. It's incredible. Like, it's really incredible. Like, Sony increased the draw distances and the fidelity of the image so much with that update that to not talk about it is a big gross misuse even of information. I mean, like, this is incredible what they've done here. I mean, like, looking at this again, I don't see anywhere near the peaks of the mountaintops or anything like that. This does look good here, of course. This looks pretty decent, very solid indeed. That looks about the same as I saw it on HDR. Very sharp, very colorful. Again, the candles are tone mapping tightly to the body. It looks really decent. Though I will say, now that we're at this scene, they're not looking so great. They're definitely looking a little blurbish. So, something to think about there. Also, you don't have the same level of intensity of highlight detail on the feathers on the matriarch, so I'm starting to see a trend here. For Horizon Zero Dawn, it appears as though HDR has been greatly improved by the update. And I will say that, you know, not for nothing, that's something to mention, because maybe Sony just found the secret sauce needed for next-gen gaming. And if they have, in the form of this new HDR adjustment implementation, we might see the best HDR games or gameplay that we've ever seen. Now, this, to be fair, does not work on every game. I mean, I've seen it on Injustice 2, that was the first game I tested, and it looked about the same. But I've got to say, what it's doing for Horizon Zero Dawn is incredible. I mean, now the sun, again, not as tight as it was. It's more colorful for sure, but it's not, I don't know, man. I'm preferring the HDR variant of this game for sure. Most definitely. Now, the colors are natural, again, no color bleeding or anything like that. It is brighter in all the right spots, but ultimately it's that HDR variant after the update that has me kind of like pretty blown away. It's pretty impressive to think that just an update can do so much damage. You know, and imagine the new console, the new PlayStation 5. If this is just an update for the PlayStation 4 Pro, making an old HDR game that before I completely wrote off, didn't really think much of it because it wasn't as impressive as his HDR or SDR counterpart. Now I'm starting to see this might be serious. And it has me having more faith in HDR technology going forward. Hopefully we can see more implementations like this. Let me know if you found something similar in your HDR gameplay in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, the #1 brand in honesty, and until the next video, I'll see you guys later.